The Vineyard Jeffrey Lundgren and the Kirtland Cult Massacre. On April 10, 1989, Jeffrey Lundgren ordered 2 of his followers to dig a hole in the floor of a barn. He told them to make it 6 feet by 7 feet. He already knew whose bodies would fill it. There is a specific kind of horror in the ordinary. Not the horror of the remote desert compound, the isolated mountain commune, the jungle encampment that exists so far outside normal life that its violence feels like something from another world. That kind of horror is terrible, but it's also distant. It has the quality of something that happens somewhere else, to someone else, in conditions so unusual that most people can quietly reassure themselves they would never be in them. The horror of Jeffrey Lundgren is different. It is the horror of a rented farmhouse on a country road in Ohio. Of a man who led Bible study, who remembered your kids' names, who had a gift for making scripture feel alive and urgent and personal. Of a family, a completely ordinary family from Missouri, a man and a woman and 3 daughters, who believed in something, who moved across the country for that belief, who trusted a man they had every reason to trust. And who ended up at the bottom of a pit. Kirtland, Ohio is a small town about 20 miles east of Cleveland. It doesn't look like a place where anything extraordinary would happen. Flat farmland, modest houses, the kind of quiet Midwestern geography that fades into itself. But Kirtland is historically significant to the Mormon faith in a way that makes it almost uniquely charged. The Kirtland Temple was built there in the early 1830s, one of the first temples of the Latter-day Saint movement, constructed under the direct supervision of Joseph Smith. For members of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the RLDS Church, Kirtland was sacred ground. It was a place of origin. A place where God had been present in a concrete, architectural, historical sense. Jeffrey Don Lundgren understood that. He moved his family there in 1984, from Missouri, to take a job as a senior tour guide at the Kirtland Temple. He was 34 years old. He had grown up in the RLDS Church. He was charismatic, well-read, and possessed of a particular kind of intellectual confidence, the kind that presents itself as scholarship and functions as dominance. He had a gift for making people feel that he was the only person in the room who truly understood what the scriptures were saying. And he was building something. The theological method Lundgren developed was sophisticated enough to be seductive and convoluted enough to be impenetrable. He called it dividing the word. The basis of the method was a real literary structure called chiasmus, an ancient technique, used throughout the Bible and the Book of Mormon, in which ideas are arranged in a mirrored pattern. A passage builds toward a central point and then mirrors itself on the other side, like a palindrome of meaning. Lundgren taught his followers that scripture had to be read this way, forward and backward simultaneously, like a mirror. If the corresponding sentences on either side of the central point were consistent, the central statement was truth. If they conflicted, it was a lie. He used this method to dominate every scriptural discussion he was part of. He could take any passage and, using his interpretive framework, arrive at any conclusion he wanted, and make that conclusion appear to be the mathematically necessary result of the text's own structure. Anyone who disagreed wasn't offering a different interpretation. They were reading the text wrong. He even used chiasmus to justify his specific presence in Kirtland, arguing that the word Ohio itself was a palindrome and therefore a divine signal pointing to the location's significance. What this created, practically, was a situation in which Lundgren was the indispensable interpreter. You needed him to access the truth. Without him, the text was a locked room. With him, it opened. That's not theology. That's a dependency. By 1987, Lundgren's behavior had become erratic enough that the RLDS Church took action. He was dismissed as a lay minister. He was fired from his position as a tour guide amid suspicions that he had embezzled approximately $40,000 from the church. He was evicted from church housing. He moved his family and a small group of devoted followers, fewer than 20 people in total, into a rented farmhouse outside Kirtland. And then, on October 10, 1988, he was officially excommunicated from the RLDS Church. On that specific day, the day the institution formally rejected him, a thunderstorm rolled through the area. And as the storm broke, a rainbow appeared over the farmhouse where Lundgren and his followers were living. Most people see a rainbow after a storm and feel something simple. A bit of light after darkness. Jeffrey Lundgren looked at that rainbow and told his followers that God had just opened the 7 seals of the Book of Revelation. He told them he was God's final prophet. He told them the second coming of Christ would occur on his birthday, May 3rd, at the Kirtland temple. That they would seize the temple by force, cleanse the surrounding land, and God would appear. And they believed him. After the excommunication and the move to the farmhouse, Lundgren implemented what researchers who study cultic organizations would recognize as a comprehensive program of psychological control. He isolated his followers from the outside world. Contact with family members who weren't part of the group was discouraged and eventually forbidden. Any outside perspective was framed as spiritually contaminating. He demanded that followers surrender their financial resources to him. He required them to max out credit cards, resign from jobs, liquidate savings. The group's material resources became his resources. Financial independence, like emotional independence, was a form of divided loyalty. He forbade private communication between members of the group. He called it murmuring, a term drawn from the Book of Mormon, where the children of Lehi murmur against God's commands. In Lundgren's farmhouse, any private conversation between followers was defined as a spiritual infraction. You were to speak openly, in the presence of the group, or not at all. And then he did something that transformed the farmhouse from a strict commune into something closer to a psychological prison. He eavesdropped on his followers. Privately. Systematically. And then, during group sessions, he would casually reference things he couldn't possibly have known, details from private conversations, personal anxieties someone had expressed to a spouse in confidence, things said in whispered moments that no one else should have heard. He let his followers believe he could read minds. What does it do to a person when they believe the authority figure above them can access their private thoughts? It doesn't produce obedience. It produces something more complete than that. It produces the cessation of doubt. Because doubt lives in private. It lives in the quiet interior space where you work things out before you decide what to say. If that space is no longer private, if someone can see inside it, then doubt becomes dangerous. The only safe mental state is belief. Debbie Olivares was a member of Lundgren's group who was away making preparations during the night of the murders. She survived. And she spent years afterward trying to explain to people how she had ended up there, how an educated woman with a family and a job and ordinary common sense had come to be part of a cult that killed 5 people. Her answer was precise. She said she knew, intellectually, that she was being manipulated. She could see the mechanism. She could identify it. And she still could not stop it. She said, "I know he mind-controlled me and I didn't know how he did it. And I was terrified to be in the same room with him." When you hear it that often, and you can't question it, it's like, well, I would have drunk the Kool-Aid. That sentence, "I would have drunk the Kool-Aid," is usually said with a kind of horrified distance, as a way of emphasizing how different the speaker is from the people who actually did it. Debbie Olivares said it the other way. She said it to describe herself. She said it to describe a woman who saw what was happening and still could not get free of it. That's the thing about this kind of control. It doesn't require stupidity. It doesn't require weakness in the ordinary sense. It requires sustained, systematic dismantling of the mechanisms people use to question authority. And when those mechanisms are gone, what's left isn't a broken person. It's a person who has simply had a specific capacity removed from them, the capacity to say no. Dennis Avery was 49 years old. He was a devoted member of the RLDS Church from Liberty, Missouri. He had spent years building a life there, a steady job, a home, a community. He had a wife, Cheryl, who was 46. 3 daughters. Trina, who was 15. Becky, who was 13. and Karen, who was 7 years old. Dennis believed in Jeffrey Lundgren. He believed deeply enough to uproot his entire family from Missouri, move them to Ohio, leave behind everything familiar, and commit himself to waiting for the second coming of Christ alongside a man he trusted as a prophet of God. He was a man of faith who acted on that faith. And then Dennis made a mistake. A small one, by any ordinary measure. He opened a personal bank account. Just a small one, something to keep a modest amount of money set aside for his family's immediate needs. Not a secret account, not a hidden cache of wealth. Just a family buffer. Lundgren found out. In the theology Lundgren had constructed, a personal bank account was not a minor financial decision. It was a theological statement. It meant that Dennis's loyalty was divided. That he trusted his own judgment about his family's needs more than he trusted Lundgren's authority to provide for the group. It meant that he was holding something back. That his surrender was incomplete. And incomplete surrender, in Lundgren's system, was a form of apostasy. Lundgren began telling his inner circle that the Averys were spiritually deficient. That they were weak. That no matter how much time they were given on this earth, they would never achieve the level of faithfulness required to witness what was coming. That they were a burden the group could not afford to carry into the sacred event that was approaching. Follower Daniel Kraft remembered Lundgren's decree in terms that were chillingly administrative. He said that Lundgren had concluded that no matter how much time the Averys would be given on this earth, they would never repent, and so there was a judgment that they needed to be executed. Lundgren called what was about to happen pruning the vineyard. Removing the unworthy growth so the healthy plants could receive the fullness of the light. The preparations began in early April 1989. Lundgren ordered his followers to max out their credit cards and resign from their jobs. He told them they were preparing for a wilderness retreat, a final period of purification before the sacred event at the Kirtland temple. On April 10, he instructed 2 of his male followers to go out to the barn at the back of the farmhouse property and dig a pit in the dirt floor. 6 feet by 7 feet. Deep enough to hold 5 people. They dug it without knowing, officially, why. Or perhaps knowing and not saying. The psychology of that moment, of digging a grave on the orders of a man you believe is a prophet, is something that is almost impossible to think about clearly from the outside. On April 17, Lundgren had Cheryl Avery write a letter to her extended family. The letter said that the family was relocating to Wyoming. It was a farewell letter disguised as an update. It was designed to explain their disappearance. Cheryl wrote it. She sent it. That evening, the Avery family was invited to the farmhouse for a communal dinner. After the meal, Lundgren and his inner circle moved to the barn. They left the Avery family inside the house with the Colt's women and children. A chainsaw was started and left running inside the barn. Not for any practical purpose. To mask the sound of gunfire. Then Ron Luff went back inside and told Dennis Avery that he needed help packing camping equipment. Dennis followed him to the barn. The stun gun they had prepared to incapacitate him malfunctioned. Cult members grabbed him physically, bound his wrists, covered his mouth with duct tape, dragged him to the edge of the pit. Jeffrey Lundgren raised a .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol and shot Dennis Avery twice in the back. Dennis fell into the pit. Then Ron Luff went back inside and brought out Cheryl. Cheryl was bound. Her eyes were covered with duct tape. She was dragged to the pit. Lundgren shot her 3 times, twice in the chest, once in the abdomen. Then Trina. 15 years old. Lundgren shot her twice in the head. The first bullet ricocheted off her skull. She was still alive. The second bullet killed her. Then Becky. 13 years old. Shot twice. Then Karen. Karen was 7 years old. She was brought out of the house and into the barn and shot in the chest and in the head. When it was over, the men filled the pit with dirt and stones. Then they went back inside the farmhouse. And they held a prayer meeting. I want to stay with that for a moment. Because I think that detail, the prayer meeting immediately afterward, is one of the most clarifying things about who Jeffrey Lundgren was and what he had built. Most people, after doing what those men did in that barn, would be experiencing something overwhelming. Revulsion, panic, dissociation. Something. But Lundgren had built a theology in which what had just happened was not a crime. It was not a sin. It was not a trauma. It was an act of divine judgment, carried out by God's appointed instrument on earth, against people whose spiritual failings had made their deaths both necessary and merciful. The prayer meeting was not cognitive dissonance. It was the logical conclusion of the belief system. When you have successfully redefined murder as worship, the appropriate response to murder is prayer. The cult fled Ohio the following morning. April 18, 1989. They packed what they could and drove east into West Virginia, then eventually south and west toward California. Lundgren told his followers they would wait in the wilderness for God to appear before them, as he had always promised. God did not appear. They moved around for months. They camped. They prayed. They waited. And then, in January 1990, 9 months after the murders, a tip from an informant led federal investigators to the farmhouse in Kirtland. They pulled up the dirt floor of the barn. They found the Avery family. All 5 of them, in the pit where they had been placed. The arrests came quickly after that. The trials were long. Jeffrey Lundgren was convicted on 5 counts of aggravated murder and 5 counts of kidnapping. He was sentenced to death on September 26, 1990. His son Damon, who had helped bind the victims, received 120 years to life. His wife Alice, who had been complicit in the planning and preparation though not present in the barn during the murders, received 5 life sentences, 150 years to life. Ron Luff, who had lured each member of the Avery family one by one from the house to the barn, received 170 years to life. Daniel Kraft and others who had been present received sentences of 50 years to life. Several other members of the group who had been more peripheral, Richard Brand, Greg Winship, Sharon Bluntschli, Debbie Olivares, Susan Luff, served roughly 20 years before parole. At trial and in every interview he gave afterward, Jeffrey Lundgren never wavered. He never expressed remorse. He never acknowledged that what he had done was wrong. He described the massacre as the execution of divine judgment. He described his own participation as a reluctant duty, the burden of a prophet who must carry out God's commands even when his human flesh finds them difficult. He said he had his own emotional struggles making his flesh go through with the act. That it was not some pleasant event, but that it was the execution of judgment. As if he had been asked to do something unpleasant by a superior and had dutifully complied. As if Dennis and Cheryl and Trina and Becky and Karen Avery had been an inconvenience to him. Jeffrey Lundgren exhausted 16 years of appeals. He raised questions about mitigating evidence and the effectiveness of his counsel. The courts reviewed his case multiple times. In the end, on October 24, 2006, he was executed by lethal injection at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. He was 56 years old. The barn where the Avery family had been buried was demolished the following year. Here is what I keep thinking about. Jeffrey Lundgren was not a desert prophet. He was not the product of a multi-generational fundamentalist compound, isolated from mainstream society since birth, raised entirely within a closed ideological ecosystem. He was a tour guide at a tourist attraction. He drove a car. He went to a grocery store. He watched television. He existed, for most of his adult life, in the ordinary world. And so did his followers. They had jobs. They had extended families who weren't in the group. They came from Missouri suburbs. They had neighbors who knew their names. They were not cut off from reality in any geographic or institutional sense. And they still ended up in that barn. The mechanism Lundgren exploited wasn't a flaw in his followers. It wasn't a weakness unique to people who were already broken or desperate or unusually susceptible. It was the same mechanism that draws people to any institution offering certainty in an uncertain world. He promised that the world had a structure, a pattern, a hidden architecture that could be accessed if you knew the method. He promised that the sacred texts, the ones his followers had been raised to revere, contained a deeper truth than anyone had previously been able to unlock. And he promised that with his guidance, with his method, with his interpretation, that truth was available to them. That's a very human need. The need for meaning to be structured. For the universe to be organized rather than random. For there to be a code that, once decoded, makes everything make sense. And the people who exploit that need, the ones who offer themselves as the key, the interpreter, the prophet, aren't always easy to spot. They are not always visibly extreme. They are not always violent from the beginning. Sometimes they are the man who remembers your kids' names at church. Sometimes they are the scholar with the compelling method. Sometimes they look like someone who really understands what you're looking for. And they are already counting the steps between you and the barn. Dennis Avery never knew he was on a list. He opened a bank account to protect his family. That's all he did. And it was enough.